We're going to wrap up today's conference with from some questions to these guys. But let me begin by actually introducing Tony Renke, who's stepping in for Ryan, who is somewhere in the sky to some foreign lands called Michigan for a wedding. But Tony is in his fourth year at Desiring God, where he's a staff writer and researcher. He hosts a popular Ask Pastor John, which many of you probably listen to. He's authored 2 books that deal with imagination and what he calls the non-fiction imagination, books that focus on the potency of imagination for spiritual growth and gospel ministry. One is called Lit, a Christian guide to reading books, and the other one, which is coming out next month, I have a sample of here, Newton on the Christian Life to Live is Christ. And Tony and his wife are raising their 3 kids here in Richfield, Minnesota. So I'm actually going to toss you the first question, Tony. You describe in Lit the basically primary and secondary imagination. And can you just tell us what the difference is between them and how those categories help us understand how our imaginations work?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's good to be here, by the way. Thank you for having me. And primary imagination is the idea that we can recount in our minds things that we've previously experienced. So I think I used the illustration of taking the garbage out on a hot summer night. We all know, especially if kids in diapers, like you know what that's like. It's not very fun. And if just mentioning that to you, you can relive that experience of taking the garbage out. But there's another form of imagination that I think we as humans have that's very unique, and that is that we can imagine things that we've never personally experienced. So if I said when you took that garbage out to the trash can and you took the lid off of your garbage can and a sapphire blue, beautiful rainbow of light shot out of it across the sky, you can imagine that in your mind even though you've never experienced that. And so there's...
I have though.
Have you? Yeah.
Only Nate could have experienced that.
So God has given us this imagination to put together. I think Kevin Van Hooser calls the imagination the power of synoptic vision. And that is that we can put together things in our minds that we've never physically seen with our eyes. And that's what makes novel writing, I think, possible. It's just being able to put together pieces that are brilliant. And it's a capacity that God has given us, uniquely to humans.
Excellent. So thinking, again, how the imagination functions, any of you, how would you say imagining our way to see the world relates to our affections? We've kind of touched on this a little bit throughout the talks. How do those two work together?
Yeah, okay. Tolkien talked through the best fairy stories aren't mainly about can this happen, but desirability. That's traditionally beauty is the aspect of the world that causes desire in us to rise up, and the imagination is there to sort of enable us to go after the desires that we would. God put a Jesus-shaped hole in our hearts, and our imaginations are there to see how in the world we can get to that place, to draw connections between things that we see and those theological realities, the spiritual realities, the big real that we should and do already long after.
I think that the world in which we live is completely ungraspable, and trying to retaining your own experiences exactly second by second is impossible. Like there's the volume of God's narrative is way beyond us, and imagination is the tool He's given us to attempt to grasp the ungraspable. Imagination is the handle we put on it, both primary and secondary, to experience what the world is really like. It's our way of condensing and reducing, and still it blows our minds. Mm-hmm. But just trying to get it into our minds at all, either through memory or through projection with fiction.
Peter Kreeft has a thought experiment that he uses when he teaches on heaven, and he tells people to imagine what would heaven be like for you if you were God. So you could create your own heaven. What would that be like? And so we could come up with, and
Hell.
you would just, yeah, that's right. That's where it would lead. But you think of, all the material possessions that you could ever have, you can give yourself. All the pleasures you could ever think about, you could give yourself. Every ounce of gold you ever wanted, diamonds, every physical material thing you could imagine is yours. Then he says, how long would that satisfy your soul? Maybe 20 years, 40 years, 80 years, 100 years. Okay, let's think of more noble things like good friendships. Let's say eternity for you is being surrounded by 1,000 great close friends, and you have intimate fellowship with those people, and you have more noble aims. How long would that satisfy you? And Peter Kreeft says maybe 600 years, 700 years, 800 years. And then you keep pushing through, and you keep thinking of what is it that could actually make you joyful forever. And your imagination hits a limit for which you can't get past. And what Peter Kreeft says essentially is that your affections go deeper than your imagination. So we talk about the imagination and how it is just this ocean of incredible glory that we're trying to grasp onto, and everything that we can imagine doesn't go close to satisfying the desire that we have for eternal pleasures forevermore in the presence of God. That is completely unfathomable to the human imagination. So affections go way deeper than the imagination. I think that's the takeaway. As a Christian hedonist, I'm trying to use the imagination to point people to Christ, but I ultimately know that those desires are way beyond what we can even fathom for those who are in Christ Jesus.
So what about when we get to heaven? Is imagination no longer necessary? Is it merely a creaturely defect, or is it an attribute that continues on into heaven?
When you get to heaven, are you going to be infinite?
So what's it look like? Is it?
No, of course not.
Yeah.
Of course there's imagination. Like, you're still a creature. And I think, part of the way you see God give us narratives now, I think you'll still get blisters, you'll still get calluses, you'll still bleed. Like, there's still going to be, there's this, I think what Lewis grasps with the further up and further in-ness of it all. As soon as you say, have whatever you want in heaven, and you start, your dreams, for me, it'd just be like one flying stick that you could hang on to and go. Just like a handlebar. And that would last a lot more than 80 years for me. But I think that the imagination will continue to exist because God's art will continue to exist, and God's art will continue to be way too big for us to possibly get a handle on, and we will continue to chase it and be in pursuit of it, but always getting closer and never arriving because we never can be Him. So that journey and that process, which is enabled by the imagination, that's how we receive and respond. That's how we, the call and answer, the call and response from God, that's how it's done. He creates, we receive and compress and imagine and try to process. And I think that's going to continue on till the very end.
You could think through it doctrinally, right? The new creation is the glorification and redemption and glorification of the original. And that includes man, made in the image of God, body and soul together, being restored into the image of His Son. And so in the new heavens and new earth, the work that we do bodily, using our imaginations, our reason, our hands, is going to continue exactly for what Nate said. We are not infinite, and yet it's the source of our imaginings is. And those desires, those affections go together with the resurrection of the body at the end to bring that to pass. Tolkien puts exactly that into that long poem, Mythopoeia, that he wrote for Lewis, that we are made as little makers, and that doesn't go away at the fall. And that for eternity, that's going to continue. You can see it there in the poem, or you can go to his little short story in the book called Leaf by Niggle and see Niggle not being able to finish his imaginative painting of his leaves on his tree, and yet after death, is what takes place. Bringing that glory of that bit of the nation into God's kingdom.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go for it.
I'm used to the Ask Pastor John pod because I like to ask questions.
I'm supposed to be the one who's asking questions, but okay.
Nate, do you believe that you'll be writing novels in eternity?
I sure hope I don't have to. But I think storytelling, yeah. I think storytelling will absolutely continue because we're the image of God. The image of God will be made even richer and even more full than it is now. more fully enfleshed, and God will continue to tell stories. God is telling a story. Heaven is a continuation of the story. And just so you know, unfortunately, this goes back to what I was saying in the talk about how we try to say what God is like and then we fail miserably. We tend to think that heaven's going to be boring, like just singing and singing and singing. And we already hate it when the Sopranos won't stop now. And, it just sort of, really, is this what we're doing? It's gonna be so much richer. It's gonna take this little seed of a lifetime here, then explode into a much bigger story. Given that the story will continue, given that God will continue telling stories in the way He does, but with resurrected characters, obviously I think that we will image Him in that. We will continue to pursue that. I think that's one of the truest ways that we image Him is in storytelling. So it doesn't mean that I will be typing, but as far as telling narratives, crafting narratives, and imitation of His, absolutely. And I look forward to finally hearing some of the ones that are out of reach for us now. I was like, there's so many things that are just kind of around the corner. And when I read great authors, the things that really grab me or hook me or stay with me permanently in this weird sort of sensational way, like you feel it, are things like in The Paths of the Dead in Tolkien, when you hit the door that's sealed, and there's the skeleton and the fingernail marks, and this guy's broken sword, he was trying to get into this door, and he failed, and he died right here. And it's just kind of like, oh, and we move on. There's this whole other thing, there's this whole other story. And that happens to me every time I pass a car at night on the highway. Like, there goes another pair of headlights, like where are they going? Like, that's, and then these ones, and then those ones, and then that ladybug. It's like, it's just, what are they doing? Like, I look forward to the big ladybug dramas and all sorts of processing narratives that we can't even get to yet. So yes, I'm going to tell stories.
Good.
Yeah.
I hope to read them. Let's talk a little bit about how imagination helps us in crafting stories. So Nate, question for you first. C.S. Lewis talks about in his short essay on stories about the atmosphere in stories, and he calls it the kappa element. And that atmosphere is not necessarily what we're looking at, but what we feel around us. And so he talks about the pirateness of a pirate story. What's the atmosphere you're trying to create in your stories, and how do you do it?
I'm trying to create wonder and a sense of the overwhelmedness. Lewis talks about pirateness. I'll talk about overwhelmedness. Discovery of the vastness of creation, the vastness of this narrative in which we exist, but really wonder and mystery. So if I can start with one, if I can get that atmosphere, that taste and that smell, we've all been there. I hope you've all been in a place where you're looking around thinking, I can't even, how do I know this? How do I get this? There's this knowledge that's over there. There's this mountaintop. I'd love to be on that, looking that way. Like, what is over there? And I can't reach it, and I can't get to it. So starting with characters who are trapped and not open to that wonder, and then transitioning into that wonder is something I'm always trying to do. That's kind of like right at the heart. The numb American modern child, adult, teen, whatever, how do I take them and then scrape the calluses off and make them really feel? So doing that with the everyday, starting with the expected, and then scraping it more and more into the mysterious until they're ready to marvel at this reality. And that's the goal. So wonder, overwhelmedness, mystery. And I think that you can do that with pirateness, you can do that with a superhero, you can do that with any number of genre types that would involve a different kind of experience or sensation. But that's kind of like the meta atmosphere that I'm going for. And that one of the reasons why Lewis complained about film adaptations is because they would swap out like types of fear. He complained about King Solomon's mines. Like, it's different to have an earthquake, to be scared of an earthquake, than to be trapped in the dark. Like, to be sealed in a cave and stuck is different than than being chased by savages. Like, there's different types of fear. The spider dropping down the neck of your shirt down your back is different than a guy pulling a gun on you in an alley. It's like they're both fears, but they're different kinds of fears atmospherically. And what he hated about Hollywood more than anything was the fact that they would just interchange types of fear. They would interchange the atmospherics. and that he thought it ruined it. So a movie like King Solomon's Mines is ruined because the atmosphere, the type of fear shifts, and he wants that experience, that sensation. So that's something I've always enjoyed in his writing when he complained about that kind of thing, which is why I hate the Lord of the Rings movies. Again, just to circle back.
Not to mention the Hobbit movies.
Do those exist? I mean, yeah, so the atmospherics are all totally changed. Like, everything's different.
So, Tony, you want to be able to do this in nonfiction imagination. Is there an atmosphere in nonfiction?
No.
My imagination is blown away by what is in Scripture, and Nate has alluded to this already. I've said the book of Revelation is the most, it stretches your imagination the most of any book in the Bible. Gene Fant, who's a lit scholar, actually pushes back on me on that and says Ezekiel is, so take your pick, Ezekiel or Revelation. Both of them just stretch your imagination. We're talking about dragons. We're talking about Revelation 12 is a version of the Christmas story that you'll never see in a Christmas card ever. I mean, it is grotesque, it is graphic, it is bloody, it is persecution, it is nasty, and yet it's like the real Christmas story. Read Revelation 12 sometime, and just look at it from that perspective. It'll blow your mind. Your imagination will just be filled with incredible things. And so when I read Colossians 1:15, so Christ is before all things. He's in all things. He's the creator of all things. He holds all things together. The heavens and the earth were somehow rent and dislocated by sin, right? So you have the heaven and earth are dislocated by sin, and Christ, by shedding his blood, reorders heaven and earth. He disarms the powers and principalities to make that possible. And the reason we know that Jesus actually did that is because this building exists. The church exists, which is proof of a cosmic victory that Christ has won in the past. So just read Colossians 1:15 to 20, and your mind will be blown by the imagination it takes to actually comprehend what is happening there in reality. That's why I think imagination will probably exist in heaven, is because we're always going to have to somehow wrestle with this idea that Christ brought heaven and earth and sync them back together by his blood, and that became the church. The church is the victory banner saying that Christ won a cosmic victory and reoriented the heavens and the earth. So there's so much to say that it requires imagination. I just finished a book project on John Newton, and one of the things that he does really well is when he would get a letter from the most despondent, the most self-condemned, or the most depressed people, he would always go to the imagination. And he would recount the stations of the cross. He would walk people through the death of Jesus Christ and what happened. And then he would lead them to the tomb to see Jesus Christ raised from the dead. Then he would lead them to the ascension and to show them that Christ now exists in glory. He's seated in a heavenly throne. And for him, when he was dealing with the most difficult pastoral cases, he would go to the imagination. He wasn't going to reason them out of their self-doubt or their self-condemnation or their depression that they were facing. He was going to take them to the cross, and the way he did that is through the imagination. And that, I think, is the power of the nonfiction imagination for pastoral ministry today, is we just constantly need those reminders of what Jesus Christ has done on our behalf, and it requires the imagination and reliving those vivid scenes. We are always to live with that in mind. And so I've taken that from Newton, and other people have done that well, but I think there's a very strong use of the imagination when you're dealing with the glory of Jesus Christ.
Just to pile on that, imagination is required in order to not just be a sack of dead enzymes, like decomposing rot on the ground. If you're alive, if you're hearing words, if you are using words, then the imagination is active. So what I was talking about, the inescapability of the physical nature of communication and of stories, it doesn't matter if it's a true story or a made-up story. What matters is that it's a story. No matter what you do with ink on paper or with your voice in a microphone right now, you cannot retell the story of the cross exactly as it happened. It cannot be done because your words aren't big enough to become flesh, because you can't speak the language God speaks when it actually creates Romans. It's like in Pharisees, it can't be done. So I say Pharisee, I make that noise, I start with the PH, I send out this little physical symbol to you, a symbol of Pharisee, and you receive it and then you imagine. Fiction, nonfiction, it's like it's all imagination. It takes imagination for me to choose my words. I'm picking physical shapes that I think will successfully physically imitate the actual scene and have the same kind of, as close to the same kind of physical sensational response to the real as possible, but it requires my imagination, it requires your imagination. So there's reasons why you can't use certain words. If I describe a woman as cute, well, you immediately picture a woman who's more like the physical shape of that word. Like, I used cute. And that word is closed off consonants, a tight little, here it is, it's little, she's a cheerleader. If I say gorgeous, then there's a different shape to that word, and it's no accident that gorgeous and knockout and bombshell all have the same stress structure, two-syllable trochee, and all of them have also the subconscious freight of violence. Gore. Like describing a beautiful woman with the first syllable of gore, and then bomb and knock. Like it's violent. Like, this is a beauty that violently affects you, and so you create. I grab a little noise, I grab a physical noise, I play that noise on my flesh strings, I send it out to hit you in the head, and then you imagine. So whether you're talking about the cross, or you're talking about something real, something that happened yesterday, or something that's a story about fairies and, the fact that Tinkerbell died in an accidental shotgun blast, or whatever it was, I can make something up and you'll imagine it, and I can tell a true story and you'll imagine it. All of it is compression, reduction, reimagination, and communication. Some of it's true, some of it's false, some of it's true but falls short. It all varies. The imagination is inevitable just to be creatures trying to talk about God's art.
The thing that strikes me about Christology is that when Paul says we're being transformed from one degree of glory to the next, it's the glory of Christ beheld in the Word, of course, that does that changing. And so what is the glory of Christ? Well, the glory of Christ is the whole sum total of who he is and what he's done, right? And so there's, in some sense, Paul expects for us to see Christ and to see in him the fulfillment of all these prophecies, to see him as God's son, divinity, humanity, 100% together, glorified in heaven now with the cross in there and the resurrection in there and the cosmic victory in there. All of that together is, again, why Kevin Van Hooser calls the imagination the power of synoptic vision. You're able to see all that at once and see Christ in his glory and dwell on that, and that's what transforms us. So there's this power. The imagination allows us to put all those pieces together. He is the lion and the lamb at the same time. And that transforms us.
So Matt, following up on this about words, so Tolkien seems to care a lot about how we name things, right? So what is he trying to teach us in our care of language and our use of language in his careful study of facsimiles of older languages? So how does he weigh in on this conversation?
Well, like any gift that you receive from someone who loves you, you want to take really good care of it and use it well and not badly. You don't want to turn your gift of music into what Melkor did. So he thinks we need to be choosing the right words to communicate important things, communicate anything, right? If primary reality, the world that God has created, the grace that he's been showing to us in Christ, if that's really, really important, then the words, and even down to the sounds, the syllables, the rhythms that we choose, those matter a lot. For Tolkien, it's knowing where the word comes from. Ringwraith is one of those words that he chooses to describe these 9 former men who now have these rings of power and have been turned into neither living nor dead, right? Well, why wraith? I think part of it is how Joseph Pierce walks us through it. Wraith relates to a couple different things in Anglo-Saxon, which is a wisp of smoke. Wraith, I think, is how they pronounce it. But it's also related to wrath. And also, what does a wisp of smoke do whenever it goes up from a fire? It twists and contorts around itself, but you can still see right through it even though it's a thing. That's exactly what the 9 riders are, full of wrath and anger and hatred of themselves and therefore of other men. So choosing that word to talk about the 9 riders is Tolkien being careful with this gift really, really thoroughly, that most of us don't have the time or wherewithal or knowledge to be as careful, but he would still say, that's the right word, even though you don't know it's the right word. But once you discover later that it's the right word, because Joseph Pierce in his book tells you it is, oh my goodness, now the story of the ring race becomes even bigger to you. They become even more frightening. They become even more affecting of me and my view of my sin and the world, and therefore of Christ and his grace. I think that's part of how we would speak into it.
Just to get weird fanboy,
Bring on.
Tolkien Lewis fanboy over here. One of the other things that's funny about how Tolkien worked is he would choose the word, and he would choose the word, and he wouldn't know what they were. It's like the word would define them. So they would be named and discovered, and then he would begin pursuing and unpacking what they're like because of the word, because of the name. And so he wouldn't say, man, these guys are exactly this way, and then scroll through his dictionary and then look for synonyms. It's like it was more like they were getting named, and there'd be a potency in a name, a mystery in a name, and then he'd begin pursuing and unpacking what they are because of that. So he'd frequently come at it backwards. And then Lewis and Tolkien also both loved, I don't remember where all they said this, I've seen it in letters and some other places, but they loved to talk about if you could chase the etymology backwards of human language. If you could go all the way back to the beginning and you knew the full history of every vocabulary word, then you would know everything. Like if you just took human language and backtracked it to the original starting point language, you'd know everything. And Lewis refers to it as Old Solar in the Space Trilogy, but the original language where the sound, you don't need to have learned the language, the actual speech, the speech of it is so authentic and so successfully metaphorically representative of what you mean that to hear the words is to understand them. You know, it's to experience them and see them, so that you've not spoken it, but you see them speaking it, and it's hitting you, and you know what they're saying. So and I don't think he's right, but I think it's awesome.
I think I agree with that. You see it in Sam's battle in Shelob's lair, right? Yeah. He's in the dark. He's frightened. Frodo has been taken by the giant spider, and he's got the little vial of light, and he just yells out, O Elbereth, Gilthoniel. He has no idea where it comes from. He has no idea exactly how to translate it, but he knows it's the right thing to say. It's calling upon this thing he's never really had explained to him before. But it's right, and Tolkien doesn't bother translating it for us either. He assumes we should know that it's the right thing to say at that moment.
And then Lewis in the Space Trilogy describes it as like listening to them speak this original language, the creative language is like watching castles hang in the air. It's like there's actual physical substance to the words, and you can sort of see, like the words affect your imagination directly.
Yeah, and Tolkien's going to talk through language not as being mainly developed across time to the modern day, but sort of degenerating across time. So reading Tolkien and knowing that he's writing at the same time as George Orwell, reading those two guys together, I think, is really helpful for us in our understanding of where we are today in understanding of language and meaning, that's the domain of imagination, is meaning.
We're playing fanboy tennis.
Yes. Yeah, we're gonna go different direction here.
But I will say, as far as Tolkien goes, last thing, he's wrong, and he's wrong because of Pentecost. Why? So it's language is going the right direction. And languages are remerging, languages are coming in. You know, we get to grab other languages that are good for particular expressions that ours are limited in. And so the organic nature of human language is going, I think, in the direction of a successful Great Commission. It's like we're just like the good parts of every different, like we'll use German sometimes, but rarely. And Italian and French and all the things that influence our communication. It's like our language is becoming much larger. It's growing and expanding, and then bad parts are dying off, the things that are less useful to us.
So we talked a fair bit about positive aspects of imagination, but should we be suspicious of it? To quote from Jonathan Edwards, Religious Affections, he's quoting from another guy, Anthony Burgess, who says that the imagination is that room of the soul wherein the devil doth often appear. So should we be suspicious of our imagination, and how much can we trust it?
Yeah, we should be suspicious. The term for imagination comes up 21 times in the Bible. 20 of those are negative. Imagination is an extension of self-autonomy. It's an extension of our sin. It is not an amoral faculty. It is fallen. It is wicked. It is rebellious. Where does a golden calf come from? It comes from the imagination. Where does a household idol come from? It comes from the imagination. Why does someone chop down a tree and carve up a little god, to put in their house? It comes from the imagination. The imagination is, I like to call the imagination Leviathan. The imagination is Leviathan. It is an uncontrollable force that unless God reins it in with a hook, we can't get hold of it. And so I like to talk of it in those moral categories, rather than thinking of the imagination as an amoral thing. And I think that bears out in what Ryan said earlier, Genesis 6. And it's almost like there's a play on words there. God formed man, God formed the beasts. So there's a process of his imagination creating. And then you get to man. The first time the imagination is referenced with man, it's an extension of his sin nature, which means he's making idols. So God, by his imagination, creates man. God, by his imagination, creates animals. And man, with his imagination, creates idols and sin. And I think Isaiah bears that out because the same word for imagination and idols come together in, I think, Isaiah 44. The imagination is an unruly thing. C.S. Lewis talks about going in for surgery, and he's laying there, and he's already processed. He trusts the doctor, the surgeon. He trusts the nurses. He trusts the hospital. And yet, as they slide that mask over his face to put him out, his imagination goes crazy with anxiety. It's an unruly thing. Even if you've reasoned yourself to the point where this surgery is going to turn out okay because you trust the process, the imagination can take over in a second. We call it anxiety. So there is a form of the imagination that is still unruly in the Christian life. And I think we have to acknowledge that. I think when we acknowledge the evil of the unbelieving imagination, we're also helping to explain its power.
I think to take a more doctrinal approach to it, we don't want to stand up here and talk about the greatness of the imagination simply because it is unfallen, just like medievals shouldn't talk about one aspect of us as unfallen. Total depravity means every single bit of me is broken and bent in a certain direction, including my reason and my heart, my desires, my imagination. All of it needs Christ, and all of it needs to be brought back from the dead. And so we can't talk like that, but also you see it in Tolkien in the way the good characters, there's good use of imagination, clearly. And we saw some of it today in Silmarillion from the music, or you see it in Lord of the Rings, but you also see the evil use of it. Everybody starts off good because they're all creatures, and then they can use their free gifts really evilly. So the songs that Aragorn sings are healing to some, but the thing that upsets everyone and breaks fellowship in Rivendell is the poem that Sauron wrote that's on the ring. One ring to rule them all, right? That's a poem. It's a use of imagination. It's a use of language, but it's cacophonous, it's discordant, and it's evil because it brings destruction to all of how God intends things to be. So we can definitely use it for evil or for good. It has to be run through the cross for us.
Just to pile on to Tony here. The imagination's perfect. No, of course it's broken, but I think Christians have tended to be overly suspicious of the imagination, too suspicious of the imagination, and failing to recognize that it's ever present. So the golden calf problem was not imagination. The golden calf problem was failure of imagination, crappy imagination, a dumbass story. Like, look at the gold cow brought you out of Egypt. Really? I mean, it's a lame story. They made up a lame story because they were scared of the real one. And so the real one was yes to everything he was saying, yes to, I like the Leviathan analogy, but it was too scared, thinking too small, failure of imagination. Carving the speechless wood is a failure of imagination. Every form of idolatry. Materialism is a failure of imagination because it's scary to think that the spirit world exists. It's like you're always shrinking. So idolatrous imagination is always a reduction. It's overly limited and stilted. But I would say that you should be as suspicious of your imagination as you are of your emotions, as you are of your intellect, as you are of walking, of your muscles. It's like if you say, should we be suspicious of our muscles? Should we just trust them? It's like, well, of course not. We should govern them. We should take dominion over them, and we should hold them to a biblical standard. So is it biblical to imagine this in this way? If not, stop it. But the same thing applies to emotions. Is it biblical to be feeling this way? If not, stop it. Is it biblical to be thinking this way? It's like, just hold yourself accountable to Scripture in all things. And Tony's right, the imagination can romp because it can connect to the emotions very quickly and just go and take over. So you do have to sit on it and hold it to a biblical standard, but the same way we do to every aspect of ourselves. As far as the imagination being a room in the soul, I would say the imagination is in some ways the only room in the soul. So yeah, of course it's where the devil takes up residence.
So let's end our time with a real practical question. So everyone out here heard you guys talk about really cool stuff all morning and last night, and now they're wondering, leaving from here, how do I go about and become more imaginative, creative? What tips, suggestions, stories would you offer to help inspire these people to cultivate a godly theological imagination?
Be like God.
Thanks, everyone. We're going home now.
Simple. So, and I mean this in a very literal way. If you see God behaving in a certain way with his imagination, I think it's awfully arrogant to not be willing to go along with him. For you to say, oh, I hate spiders. It's like, oh, get over yourself. It's like, God doesn't. They're awesome. But in their awesomeness, they're meant to be kind of creepy. Like, you should be responding the way you are, but you should also be marveling. When you are, we were talking about the dragonfly earlier. When you see the dragonfly, if you ever get the opportunity to watch a dragonfly nymph crawl up a reed and die and rip open and then crawl out of itself and have a flying, piston-engined, firing dragonfly climb out from inside of itself, its former iteration as an underwater jet-propelled nymph. You're like, be more like that. Be more like the kind of person who would make that up. When you see God give his children way too many animals, and then you're the parent who's like, no pets. Just realize that you're not being at all like God. So you just aren't. And now maybe you have good reasons. No, it's, honey, do you realize they have hair? It's like, maybe you have a good reason. That's possible that you'll have a good reason. We couldn't take good care of it is a good reason. But just realize you are not imitating God. And be able to rationalize that, hopefully, have some sort of reason. Imitate him, imitate the kind of stories he tells, the way he rejoices, the way he overgives, the way he overforgives. Just the raucous laughter of it all in which we exist. Imitate that and process that first. I honestly think that if you just go say, where can I read books? Where can I read books about this to make me more imaginative? It's like, well, there's lots of them. Orthodoxy, C.S. Lewis, Tolkien. There's a lot of great books. But go read God's. Like read the Bible, but realize that the Bible is a book about the book. The real story is the one that happened, and the Bible is an inspired version, condensed telling of it. So you have two things. You have the created history, engulf history, swallow history, look at God's narratives, and when you have a little guy show up, like what he does with little men is hilarious, with Napoleons, and it's hilarious and dark, Napoleons and Hitlers, and it's like all these guys, and he draws a little stupid mustache on Hitler. But you can't even help but mock him, even there, with the goose stepping and the arm salute. And like, these are farcical villains, but very deadly nonetheless. Look at his creation. That means history. That means science. That means biology. But don't be numbed by the science words. Like, look at what he does. Like, and have your mind blown. And then read authors who are also looking at what he does, and they can teach you how to, like they can come alongside you that way. But I think too many Christians say, I want more imagination, which means what? Like more time in the fantasy section at Barnes & Noble? It should mean more time looking at tadpoles, more time realizing, that the eggs of a toad like burrow into the skin of the mother. Like, oh, interesting. The butterfly thing. It's like all of that stuff is where you start with God's imagination. Then you move to the humans secondarily. I mean, that's my go forth and be like God. Failure mandate.
I'll go back to Revelation one more time. If you look at the book of Revelation, it starts out saying, blessed is the one who obeys this book. And it doesn't end, but in chapter 22, it says, blessed is the one who obeys this book. Now, there's 7 letters at the beginning of Revelation, which I can understand the obedience there, but I have no idea what exactly God was thinking when he said, obey this book. I mean, this book is full of like mythological pictures and dragons and battles, and go and obey this book. So if you look at the text and you go through the book and you say, okay, what are the imperatives in the book of Revelation? The one imperative, the verb that appears over and over 23 times throughout the book is behold. How many Christians think they're obeying God when they are beholding? So the book of Revelation for me is really key in understanding that God wants us to behold, to be aware, to be alert, to use our imagination to process what he has revealed in his word and in creation and in humanity. And so that's a paradigm for me. And it's useful now because I think we live in an age that is so how-to. It's pragmatic. If this conference was, 10 ways to save your dying marriage, this place would be packed, right? And so we live in a church culture right now that is so driven by the practicals. Help me to fix my life, fix my spouse, fix my kids, fix my home, fix this and that we've lost the ability to obey God by beholding what he's done and what he's going to do. And so if you're wired like that and you really, you tend towards the pragmatic side of things, you're gonna have to work really hard to look at the world like Nate does and to read the book of Revelation and to obey by beholding. That's gonna be a spiritual fight for you. And I would just encourage you to push against and resist that impulse to reduce everything to a practical fix for your life.
Really sort of nitty-gritty practical. To do what Nate was just asking us to do, I can't do it in front of my computer screen. I'm preaching to myself here. I have to shut it and go outside, right? And our children's lives can't be lived indoors. We have to go out and get muddy and cold and hot and dirty and some of the stuff that I don't actually enjoy all the time. We have to go do it and see and behold there. And then in terms of reading, one of the things we do in our doctrine classes in the undergrad is we don't just read theology. We read novels and poetry and Tolkien. Go read different stuff. That's great stuff. So that you can see how imagination works, genre to genre to genre, and not just think the only way we can talk about the world is theological discourse. And I had one more, but I forgot it.
Well, thank you all. Let's give a round of applause to our panelists and the speakers.